Well, everyone, we get to finally talk about the iPad first generation, the first iPad that has ever came out, and we get to see how it holds up in 2023. Now, clearly, I don't think anybody should be, using this iPad anymore, but it is still a very interesting device because without this, we wouldn't have gotten all the iPad, devices after this. And it's honestly kind of surprising because I always think this iPad came out the same time as the iPhone. But this iPad actually came out, a few years after the iPhone came out, which is actually pretty interesting. So the first thing I would recommend doing is, if you don't want to buy this iPad, but you want to buy some newer iPads, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of this iPad, we did have that 9.7-inch IPS LCD panel on the front. Now, personally, I think this panel at that moment was pretty interesting. It was a big movement and a big change from their iPhone lineup. And at that moment, if you all remember, everyone was saying this is just a bigger iPhone. And even now, there's still kind of this stereotype that these iPads are clearly, oh, why would you buy an iPad? It's just a bigger iPhone. I think that stereotype has kind of gone away. I think a majority of people now consider an iPad more closely with a MacBook or a PC or a laptop rather than, comparing it straight to their iPhone anymore, which is honestly very interesting how Apple was able to kind of shift that demographic. Now, on top of that, you do have the standard bezel around it, and Apple kept the same amount of bezel for not that long of a time. I think by the time the iPad, 5th generation, and Apple kept the same amount of bezel on this iPad for a few years. I feel like they could have done a little bit of a better job, but they did keep the same exact amount of bezel for each generation for, 4 generations then, until the iPad 5th generation. Then they kind of changed it a little bit. They also made the iPad mini lineup in between and all those other iPads. But again, this was the iPad that pretty much started it all as of that point. Now, we did have the home button on the front too, and I believe the same year that this iPad came out was the same time we got the iPhone 4, but I think the iPhone 3GS came out the same time as this iPhone. And when you look at this iPad and you look at the iPhone 3GS, there are tons of similarities. It's pretty interesting how similar looking the iPhone 3GS and the iPad, first generation actually kind of look like. Now, we did have the headphone jack on this iPad too, but we also had that, 30-pin connector on the bottom. So this was a very interesting thing that Apple did. I always found it very funny looking at older Apple products with those 30-pin connectors. It honestly was a really, really big connector and kind of inconvenient, especially when we had micro USB at that moment. Basically, all phones as of this point, if they were Androids, did have micro USB. And if you had a, iPad or if you had an iPhone with a 30-pin connector, it was definitely showing its age. But regardless, it's what it is. Now, I will say this iPad on the sides, the flat sides of it, definitely make this thing feel a little bit more, modern. When you look at the current iPads, they all, for the most part, at least the premium ones, all have flat sides, which is nice. They all also, pretty much share the same design as this thing, which is very interesting. And on the back of this iPad, we pretty much had that standard aluminum back. Now, it did curve on the back, which was very funny. I think nowadays having an iPad or device that is curved at all in any way is probably against the norm, considering we have flat sides, flat backs, pretty much everything is flat on these iPads. Nowadays, back then actually, it wasn't quite the case. And I kind of like this type of design from Apple. I still think it looks very good for the most part. Now, if you're looking closely, you may see that this iPad is actually missing a few things. One, it's missing a lightning port. I wish it had lightning, but again, it wasn't made at this moment. But it's also missing the cameras on this iPad as well. This first generation iPad did not have any cameras on it. I feel like even at that moment, Apple probably could have threw a camera on this specific iPad. They didn't end up doing it, and I always found that very, very funny. Had this thing had a front camera or a back camera, I think it would have made this thing look, or at least not perform a little bit better, but make it seem like a better deal. I still think in this day and age, all those tablets that didn't have a front or back camera, things like the Nexus 7, the original one, a lot of other tablets here and there, they didn't really have any front or back cameras. This one in particular did actually end up, not having it either. And I think that was another funny thing that actually ended up happening. So in terms of the outside, I still think in this day and age, this is still an iPad that holds up decently well in the build quality standpoint. I don't think it looks outdated. It definitely looks like a very old iPad, but I think this thing still has a kind of design twist to it, which makes it look just a little bit better. I don't know the best way to describe it, but I think it looks way better than a lot of people actually will give it credit for. So in terms of that kind of covers it up on the outside. Now in the performance segment, or at least in the software longevity point, I think most of us know this by now, this iPad really isn't getting any more updates anymore. It started off with iOS 4. It did end up with iOS 5.1.1, which honestly, as you all can probably tell, it's been outdated for a long period of time. It's been many, many years since this thing's been outdated. So I don't think anybody should even consider using an iPad like this anymore. I don't think or see why anybody would want to buy and use an iPad like this as their main device, considering a lot of older iPads, even like an iPad 5th generation, is still supported with software and it's still kind of decently performing well compared to this thing. So I wouldn't really recommend buying an iPad first generation anymore at all to use because of the software update situation, but we do have to give it a lot of credit. Without this iPad, we wouldn't have gotten the other iPads after this. But the other thing Apple was trying to do was they were trying to quickly go through and iterate on these iPads as fast as possible. They were trying to go through and make a really good iPad. And it's funny because nowadays we consider iPads and we consider them, probably long-lasting devices at the end of the day. So personally, it's very interesting when you kind of look at this iPad. It didn't last that long, but when you look at the other iPads after this, they last fairly long amounts of time, including the iPad 5th generation, which is still getting software support. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. In the performance side, this iPad had that Apple A4 chip inside of it with 256 megabytes of RAM. Now, if you can think about how little of RAM that is, it's actually kind of crazy. I mean, most games nowadays are probably more RAM than how much RAM this whole entire iPad actually had. Now, luckily for us, majority of our iPads nowadays have way more RAM than our iPhones. I think some iPads go up to 8 or 16 gigabytes of RAM now. It's actually quite insane. So, like I said, at this moment, I can see why a lot of people will look at this iPad and compare it straight to more so of an iPhone, considering the touchscreen and the design and the home button. But nowadays, Apple has done a great job, like I said before, at kind of comparing and kind of removing that comparison between an iPad and iPhone and moving it upwards towards an iPad and MacBook, which is exactly where Apple wants us to go. They want us to compare those two devices because, most people probably end up either buying both or they'll probably end up buying the MacBook, which is more expensive. A majority of people who have an iPhone will definitely have an iPad or a MacBook, but a majority of people who have a MacBook or iPad may not have each other, in a way. So the performance side of this thing at this moment, funny enough, it still is actually fairly smooth. I've talked about this for many years now, but it's actually quite insane when I actually use this iPad, which I don't use every day, but whenever I pick it up to make videos like this, it's actually insane how smooth operating, this thing is still going. Now, I think if you have something like the latest iPad, it's going to be performing better, but this thing, for how old it is still is kind of insane in my opinion. Even in the battery life department, with that 6,600 mAh battery inside of it, that is a massive size battery to have on side of this thing. So that is another massive thing going for this iPad. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, I will definitely tell you, please do not buy this iPad. Don't even consider using this iPad as your main device. But when I look back and I look at this iPad, it is insane that this was the originator in a way. This was the first iPad. And ever since then, we've gotten, tons of improvements, tons of new things. And I'm just thinking that this iPad is in a really, really good spot. So, it's a collector's item, use it as a collector's item, but I wouldn't recommend buying this thing as like an everyday device by any means. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.